little bit about classification. So this may be review for some people, but it is still important. Okay, and it's important to frame our entire discussion of animals this quarter. Okay, this first slide, this first slide um, represents the four kingdoms that we consider to be in the domain Eukarya, which means that these organisms are made of eukaryotic cells. For our purposes in this class, eukaryotic cells are more complex. They have a nucleus that protects the DNA, and then they have many individual organelles that do different jobs in the cell. We're not going to go into those organelles again. That's really freshman bio. You just need to know that they have them, basically. Okay? Now, any living thing that is a eukaryote would be placed into one of these four kingdoms. So you've got animals, plants, fungi, and microorganisms. This is like the miscellaneous category. The more scientific term for microorganisms in this case would be Protista, the kingdom Protista. And that's like a catch-all kingdom, a miscellaneous kingdom, where we put eukaryotic cells that don't really fit in any of the other three kingdoms. So maybe they move like an animal because they have a little flagellum, but they're photosynthetic, like euglena. Okay, we don't have a good answer for where to put those yet. Okay, so we put them in this third kingdom or this fourth kingdom here. Fungi we're really not going to talk about very much. Those are decomposers, mushrooms. For a long time, they were classified as plants, but it turns out that their cell walls are made of a completely different molecule than plants make theirs out of. And it's actually the same carbohydrate that arthropods make their skeletons out of, their exoskeletons out of. So you'll learn about that in a couple weeks. We've already talked about plants, and now we're focusing on animals. Okay? So that little brainstorming you did in the beginning about what is your favorite animal. So that is the kingdom we're in now. Okay? Oh, here we go. So classification is nothing new. Uh, thinkers have been trying to classify living things for thousands of years. Um, the science of taxonomy is just naming and grouping things based on the characteristics that they share. So more closely related organisms then would be in more similar categories. Okay. It did begin with Aristotle. He usually gets credit for being the first person to try to classify things. But keep in mind, he was doing this 2,000 years ago, or some maybe even longer than that now. I don't have an exact date off the top of my head, but he didn't do a great job. Okay, he basically put everything into two groups: animals or plants, and then he classified them based on where they lived. So he would say like, these are flying animals, and then that would be a group. Okay. Now the issue with that is there's a lot of things that say live in the ocean that are not closely related at all. So for example, whales and sharks, they both live in the ocean, but one is a mammal and another is a fish. Okay, not that closely related. Okay, whales are more closely related to wolves than they are to sharks. Okay, and if you are just looking at only surface characteristics or only habitat or only things like that, you're going to be missing important connections and important characteristics. Okay, so we don't use that classification anymore. Okay. So how do we use it? Well, or why do we use it? Well, think about your closet, right? Like this is the example I always use. Like if you just did I mean, maybe some of you do this. Maybe like on a long week you do this. You just do laundry and you just open up your closet and just throw it all in there, right? You don't organize it. You don't fold it. You don't hang anything. You don't put anything in drawers. You don't put your socks together or your underwear together. You just mix it all up. Well, when you go to get ready in the morning, you better give yourself like 15 or 20 minutes to go through that pile of stuff to find two socks, a shirt. Now, yes, exactly, and then it's gonna be all right. That's a whole nother thing, right? Imagine if you went to like the Jewel and um you're looking for say cereal, but in every aisle, whenever a shipment of food comes in, they just like dump it out on the floor and then drive away, and they don't organize it at all. Okay, so like the fruit snacks could be next to the I don't know, bottled water, and you would have to go through each individual aisle to try to find what you want. So we take classification for granted. We classify all kinds of things in our daily lives, and the real point of that is to make things easier for us. Okay. Now, scientific classification or taxonomy is used in a similar way. So let's say the field work that you guys have been doing, right? Maybe you weren't able to get the specific species of a tree, but you could tell that it was a gymnosperm, right? Even if you don't know specifics about that species, if you know it's a gymnosperm, you already know some things about it. You know it produces cones. You know it has vascular tissue. You know that it produces seeds in those cones, right? So that helps you kind of organize and approach studying living things. And then, in addition to that, taxonomy helps scientists communicate with each other. So, for example, in southern Texas and Mexico, okay, let's say you are studying uh, jaguars. Now, jaguars don't know they're being studied for the most part, unless you're harassing them. So they cross borders all the time. They're going back and forth from Texas to Mexico, and there are populations that spread all the way from southern Texas all the way down into Central America and then South America, right? Now, in every country that you cross, right, different languages are spoken, and even common names for that animal change based on where you live. Okay. Now, that doesn't work for science. That's not a great way to communicate. Okay. Um, so, taxonomy is also a way, a scientific name for an organism allows scientists to always be talking about the same thing. Okay. I think I counted last time I tried to count, like an animal like a mountain lion, right, has like 13 different common names just in the United States. So it's like a puma, a cougar, a mountain lion, a catamount, right? They're all talking about the same animal, right? And that can be really confusing. Not only that, there's a lot of animals that are the same thing that we don't even like think about. So like a woodchuck and a groundhog are the same thing. They're the same animal, but for some
Are you
reason we have,
serious?
yes, they're exactly the same thing. We just have two different common names for it. Now, why? Don't know. And I bet 99% of people would say they're two different animals. They're not. They're the same animal. Okay. There might have been some regional variance in what you called it. Like maybe in one region they called it woodchuck and in another they called it groundhog, but they're the same thing. Okay. Yes. Yes. Now that's really important. So um, the question that just came up in class is, okay, well, what about things that you can tell, like just on the surface, like our gut tells us, well, those must be closely related, like alligators and crocodiles. Now they are different. Okay. Now the interesting thing about that is their ranges overlap. So there are some places where, say, the American crocodile and the American alligator both live. So that can be really confusing, right? Well, turns out American alligators are much more adaptable. So crocodiles tend to live in brackish water, which is slightly salty. So they do really well in like mangrove swamp forests. Alligators, though, I mean, they can expand into swamps and wetlands without super specific conditions. So when you see reports coming out of like Florida about like if there's an alligator in my pool, most of the time it's like an alligator, not a crocodile, right? Because crocodiles are actually really endangered. Um, they're just being outcompeted by alligators, and alligators do better around humans than crocodiles do. But there's a lot more into that, but yes, there are differences. Crocodiles, I know one of them has more rounded like jawline, and the others is more pointed. I want to say the crocodiles is more pointed, but I can't remember quite correctly. But yes, now you can find both in Florida again. Now, so so that's kind of why. These are the exact reasons why we need an organized way to talk about things. The other reason is, yes, we're not we still do discover, well, not discover. This is a bad way to put it. Scientists assign new scientific names every year. So every year there are species that are named by scientists that haven't gotten a scientific name before. Now, again, that doesn't mean that people didn't know they existed, right? Like native peoples have probably been interacting with these animals or plants or fungi for thousands of years and have their own names for them, right? But in order to be officially placed into this text, this modern system of classification, they're given a scientific name. Okay? So every year there are thousands of plant species that are given a scientific name for the first time, just because they have not been observed by a scientist before. Again, that doesn't mean the scientists discovered it. In most cases, they didn't. And in most cases, the scientists would not have been able to find them without local guides. Does that make sense? So you got to be careful with your wording on this, okay? So this is the guy, of course, 17th century person with a wig, okay? This is the guy who is given credit for coming up with this system. Now, we would probably not be talking about him anymore if he hadn't put a key feature into the system, and that's that the system can change, okay? So his system is highly flexible, and as you make new discoveries, you can change the system to fit those discoveries. Okay, so like let's say we discover that those protists that we were talking about at the beginning of class. Let's say we discover that based on genetic DNA, based on testing DNA, that there are two big groups of those microorganisms that are closely related to each other. Well, we can split that and make a new kingdom, right? So the framework still works, and we can make more groups inside of those bigger groups. Okay, and that's why we still use this system today. It's not that he was right about everything. He wasn't. He was wrong about a lot. But we can change his system to make it more accurate. And that's why we still use it today. Now, binomial nomenclature literally means two name naming system. Okay? So even the name itself has two names. Now, the reason we do this is that every living thing is referred to by scientists by its genus name and its species name. Okay. So, for example, humans. So humans would be the common name. Our scientific name is Homo sapiens, and now I think it's even Homo sapiens sapiens, like wise man or something like that. But okay. Now you probably know a lot of scientific names already, even though you may not know it. So we'll get to that in a second. But this is the 7-level system that he developed. Is this ringing a bell from freshman year? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, we're not going to spend too much time going over this, but what you need to know is that we're going to be really focused. Obviously, everything we talk about this quarter is in the animal kingdom. And then we're going to be learning about nine different phyla. Okay? Phyla is plural of phylum. So we'll be learning about 9 different phyla. And for some of those phyla, we'll be learning about classes of organisms within those phyla. Okay? So this is about where we'll stop. We're not going to go too much more specific than that. Okay? So This is our classification. So we belong to the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordata. Chordates are animals that have a backbone. Okay, the vertebrae that we talked about. Okay, class Mammalia, mammals. We're mammals, so we have hair. We produce milk for our offspring. Okay, we give birth to live young. We don't have lay eggs. Okay, um, we are in the order primates, so we have an opposable thumb. We're in the family Hominidae, the genus Homo, and the species Sapiens. So our technical scientific name is Homo sapiens. At one point in human history, there were 3 or 4 members of our genus living on the planet at the same time. Right? Now, we don't know exactly what happened to those other species of hominids. Okay? There are different theories. So if anyone's ever had an ancestry.com or like 23andMe or whatever test, like they will tell you what part Neanderthal you are, like how much of your DNA is comes from Neanderthals. And so like Homo neanderthalis is one of the species that was alive in the relatively recent past, right? And so one theory is that they hybridized with humans in some places. They intermingled, intermarried with um, humans, and then those that weren't wiped out were assimilated into the population. Okay, these are the types of things that taxonomists study. Right. So now to compare this to a killer whale. So if you look at a killer whale, oops, um, we actually are in the same groups. We are in the same kingdom, phylum, and class as a killer whale. We don't split off from killer whales until you get to the order Cetacea. So whales are what we call cetaceans. Okay. And then from there, all of these aquatic animals will be broken down then into other families, genera, and species. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Now, if I was having you memorize these levels and testing you on them, this is like one way. It's like probably been taught for who knows how long. Right? This is the one that people always talk about. King Philip came over for great soup or green soup or whatever adjective you want to use. Okay. Now that is a good way to help you remember these in order. Now in modern systems, we've actually added a level above kingdoms, and we call them domains. And there are 3 of them: archaea, bacteria, and eukaryota. So eukaryotes are those 4 groups we talked about in the beginning: plants, animals, fungi, and protists. You've got all bacteria over here, okay? And then you've got archaea here. We're not going to go into the differences too much. There are some theories now, though, that say that archaea are actually the ancestors of eukaryotic cells. So archaea are single-celled organisms that tend to live in really harsh environments like ocean vents that are really sulfuric, or like hot springs in Yellowstone. You get all those beautiful colors you see from like hot springs in Yellowstone. How many people have seen pictures of that before? Where it's like blue water and then like yellow around the rim and stuff like that. Those are archaebacteria colonies. Okay, so there are so many billions and trillions of bacteria there that they actually change the color of the water. Right, so that's where that comes from. So these are then the kingdoms in those groups. Okay, so 6 kingdoms. Now I don't. We're not going to spend too much time on this. We've already talked about plants. Does anyone have any questions about what makes something a plant? Anybody? I hope not. No. Okay. So, kingdom fungi then. These are decomposers. Like you said, for many years, they were just lumped in with plants because they look similar. At least some of them do. They are actually not plants. They do have cell walls, but they're made of a different molecule, so they're not made of cellulose. Their cell walls are not made of cellulose. Okay, and they do not perform photosynthesis. Okay, so they are usually growing on dead or decomposing material. Okay, protists we already talked about. It's the catch-all group. Single-celled organisms, like we looked at yesterday under the microscope, those were in the kingdom Protista. Okay, does that make sense? So some of them move like animals, but then they don't. They're not heterotrophic. They're autotrophic. Okay, they have combinations of traits that make them hard to classify. Okay, so animals. Oop. So it might be surprising to you some of the organisms that we consider to be animals. Okay, they are eukaryotic. They are multicellular. They are heterotrophic, which means they do not make their own food. They have to consume other living things for energy. Okay, and they do not have cell walls. Notice that the traits on here are not things like move. That's not one of the traits. Not all animals actually do move in their adult stage. Okay, so uh, this this list of traits is actually not that large. Okay, the very simplest animals that we look at, starting on Monday, will probably not. You probably will not think of them as animals at all. They don't look like it. Okay, but they are technically speaking animals. These guys we're not going to talk too much about. So just a note, I've mentioned scientific names, so how do you write them? You literally just put the genus and the species together and you capitalize the genus name. That's it. Okay? If you want to abbreviate it, okay? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. So, what is your favorite dinosaur? Or if so, not let's not say favorite. If somebody asks you what is the most famous dinosaur, T Rex. Okay, that's an abbreviation of a scientific name. So capital T period lowercase rex rex T Rex. That's the abbreviation of its scientific name. Its full scientific name is Tyrannosaurus rex. That's a scientific name. Most dinosaur names that you've memorized, like Stegosaurus, Dilophosaurus, things like that, they are some part of the scientific name. Usually the genus name, okay? But in some cases the species name, the species adjective, okay? Now, that just goes to show you that like these aren't that out there. You can know these and memorize these. And there are probably a lot that you're already familiar with, even if you didn't know it was a scientific name. Okay? Now, technically speaking, these names should always be italicized. We'll be using our iPads mostly. So if you see a name like this italicized, you can assume it's a scientific name. Okay? That's just how we distinguish it. Okay? Okay. Sorry. So there we go. So here are some examples. Here are three examples. So you've got a rose, a specific species of rose. Rosacea is actually a huge family, but we're talking about a specific type of rose here, a polar bear, and a Bactrian camel. Okay? So in that first row for the rose, which letter, which letter is correctly written as a scientific name? If you are remote, you can type it in. Hang on. Oh, sorry, I can't open the chat right now, guys. Sorry about that. Okay, but the answer is C. Notice that Rosa is capitalized. It's all written in italics. Ordorata is lowercase, so that's the scientific name. In the second one, for the polar bear, which one is correct? Which one? A. Correct. A. Now, A and C, what's the difference? A is italicized. Okay. All right, and then last one is A again. Bactrian camel. Bactrian camels have one hump. Dromedary camels have two. That makes sense. Wait, is that right? No, I think this is drum. Did I do this wrong? Hang on. I'm gonna be so annoyed if I did this wrong. Oh, and this is all being recorded too. Great. Yeah. So this is wrong, guys. Bactrian camels are actually critically endangered in the wild, and they have two humps. This is a dromedary camel, not a Bactrian camel. So my apologies. Okay. All right. So the more modern application of taxonomy is we create basically what we call trees of life. So scientists want to be able to explain the common ancestry of all living things. Okay, so they make many different types of trees to show these relationships. So this is a cladogram, and this is a summary basically of the history of life on Earth, at least as far as we know right now. Now, for our purposes this year, we've already studied plants, and we are not going to really go over these branches at all. So our study starts right here with animals, right here. And from this chart, can you tell what is the first thing that's technically considered to be an animal? Yeah, sponges. Good. So sponges are the first group we'll talk about. Then we are going to go over cnidarians. So you will be observing dead sponges. You'll be observing live cnidarians, or if you're remote, at least on the microscope, cnidarians. Okay. Then we get to the three phyla of worms. So we'll talk about flatworms, roundworms, and segmented worms. Flatworms, you'll get your own flatworm. Roundworms, we don't dissect because they could still have living or eggs in them that have survived preservation. And I don't want to send you home with tapeworms, so we don't, not tapeworms, sorry, with roundworms and nematodes, so we don't dissect those. And then segmented worms, that's the first big dissection we usually do, and that's an earthworm. Okay. From there, then we go to arthropods and mollusks. Okay. Then we go to echinoderms down here, and then we do cartilaginous fish to represent all of the vertebrates. Okay, so the sharks that we look at, their skeleton is actually made of cartilage, not bone. Uh, it'll, for our purposes, it looks very similar to bone, but we'll be able to tell some differences when we look closely. Okay, so that is it for today. You don't have any new assignment. I want to just give you time to work on your seed project, your germination project. Okay, and we will start. We may do a classification activity tomorrow with I'm going to teach you how to use dichotomous keys for animals, and then we will be moving on to sponges. Okay. Question. Oh, the virtual flower dissect. Sorry. Yes. So I misspoke earlier. When I said I'm not giving you any new assignments, that is true. Okay. But technically, the last grade for the quarter is that virtual flower dissection. Okay. Hmm? Try to get it to me tonight. To be honest, I probably will not be looking at it until tomorrow night. Okay. So if you need to take the extra night for that, it wouldn't be kind of late until tomorrow night. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Any other whole group questions before I start cleaning desks? Okay, so I'm going to end this now and stop sharing.